My point is the primary responsibility for African development, for negotiation, and for serving African interests, citizens' interests, lies with African leaders. That intrinsically is not a bad thing. So it's a poor usage of that which is a bad thing. It is corruption, misappropriation of resources, illicit flows, which could be considered as bad for African economies. The critical importance of transparency, of accountability. So many of the new players may not be as transparent as they should be. So which doesn't allow the mechanism of accountability to be activated when necessary.
Hello everyone, welcome to Development Reimagined's easy to digest video and podcast series, Africa Unconstrained, supported by Quartz Africa, an essential online source for understanding the forces shaping our world. Our aim with Africa Unconstrained is to explore African perspectives on the continent's new era, especially in the context of a post-COVID-19 world. If you don't already know Development Reimagined, we are a leading independent and African-led international development consultancy with our headquarters in China and with offices in Kenya and the UK. Our mission is to provide new ideas and solutions to deal with the complexities of global poverty and climate change. And it's a mission our diverse team really strives for every day. I'm Hannah Ryder, Development Reimagined CEO, and without further ado for this session, I'm very excited to be here with our distinguished guest, Professor Landry Signé, to help reveal his unique perspective on Africa's 55 varied economies and how to protect and revitalise their growth in a COVID-19 context and possibly with China. Professor Landry Signé is a distinguished fellow at Stanford University's Center for African Studies, founding chairman of the Global Network for Africa's Prosperity. He is also a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative at Brookings Institute in Washington, DC. And he has recently published a really fantastic book, Unlocking Africa's Business Potential, Trends, Opportunities, Risks and Strategies. And we're really pleased to have him here to talk with us today. Professor Signé, I want us to start off our conversation with a number. If there was one number that you think every African should be aware of with regards to Africa's economies in a post-COVID-19 context, what would it be and why?
Hello, and thank you very much for having me, Hannah. I will think about 6.7 trillion US dollar by 2030. That is the combined consumer and business spending that Africa will have by 2030. And as a matter of fact, it's a number that I discuss in my recent book, Unlocking Africa Business Potential, released this year. And this is extremely important. As you know, COVID-19 has disrupted the global economy and affected African countries, perhaps in a different way that it affected many of the advanced economies. The health impact has been monumental in countries such as the United States, Canada, France, Spain, among others countries. But overall, the continent has not been drastically affected from a health perspective. However, economically speaking, the continent is drastically suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Having said that, by 2030, we will see a continent which will be very dynamic economically speaking, and this is for a certain number of reasons. So first, we have the population growth. The continent will be home of about 1.7 billion people by that time. But we also have the growth of the household consumption. So although the middle class or the number of people, the percentage of people with available and or discretionary income may be fluctuating due to COVID. Over the medium to long run, this number will be reaching 43% of the population. So with available discretionary income and upper income. So that is the a growth of the consumer spending, a growth of the business spending in many sectors, whether we speak about healthcare, but some of the larger sector will be food and beverage, but also agriculture, agri-industry, manufacturing, among other, and along those lines, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was just launched, at least the operational phase of the AFCFTA as in January, on January the 1st. So those are some of the core elements where I believe that the continent still has a tremendous potential.
Completely agree. And that is a really great way to kick off our discussion today. And I think it's really important that we address this question, because there is so much discussion at the moment, and we know that every African country, of course, is different, has different profile going forwards in terms of that opportunity, but also in terms of where they are right now. And obviously, many African countries have some significant financial challenges, yet there's also a lot of discussion around, a fairly negative discussion around the debt that countries have right now. So how do you bring these two together, and what lessons can we learn, for example, from history of the 1990s, 1980s debt crisis in African countries? What do we learn from that, and what does that tell us about today? Is today different because of this potential that you're talking about?
Absolutely. This is an extremely important question, because if we have to speak about that in the 90s, in the 80s and the 90s, so the nature was different from what we are having now, and for many reasons. First, to put things in context, what one of my colleagues at Cornell University has called African economies and the politics of permanent crisis, to describe the performance of African economies from the late 70s to the late 90s. And he was speaking about the politics of permanent crisis because overall, African economies have underperformed compared to their peer during that period. And that performance was explained by many reasons. So you have if you put into context the Keynesian state with the post-colonial model of development, a strong presence of the state investment in large corporation, and even when you had deficit. So you add to that also corruption among other factors. So you can clearly see that African economies were spending more than they were generating revenue. And that was not a concern for the international community at the time because of the petrodollars, but also because large economy and interventionism was broadly accepted. So the interventionist policies were broadly accepted. So that was one of the factors. And this was called the politics of permanent crisis because despite many structural adjustments, African economies have still not grown, or at least not grown quickly. Now, the difference that we have in recent years is the fact that African actors have access to a broader variety of lenders. So they have access to more, both public ones. So you have the rise of players such as China and other emerging countries, in addition of the traditional players such as the UK, France, or the international institutions such as the World Bank. So you have the rise also of private lenders. So on one hand, the rise of new public lenders, but also the rise of private lenders and the vulnerability to the market. So African economies were used to engage with bilateral or multilateral player, for which it is easier, if I can say this way, to negotiate in case of challenges. However, with the private sector, it's different. Or with market-related loan, the context is also different. So I think those are some of the core differences that we'll see also in the way that that situation has evolved. Now, many of the African economies have also been investing. We have a productive, the contracted productive loans. That's an important element to take into consideration because that intrinsically is not a bad thing. So it's a poor usage of debt, which is a bad thing. It is corruption, misappropriation of resources, illicit flows, which could be considered as bad for African economies. So I think this is also another dimension to take into consideration when we are discussing about that. So some of the most in-debt countries, including the United States, for example. So, but those are used to build the economy and to strengthen the economy. And probably the level of illicit flow of corruption, at least in the public sector, is probably much lower, or at least per indicators of the corruption perception index lower to most of the developing nations, or at least African economies. So I think that's another dimension which is also important to take into consideration. And we are in a broader international context, as many of the countries are themselves heavily investing to support their economy. So the state presence was poorly perceived, or state interventionism was poorly perceived in the 80s, in the 90s. But now, even the one which were condemning, or the countries or the experts which were condemning state interventions, are some of the one encouraging them. So I think this is also a different context that we have compared to a few decades ago. So and definitely one of the things that African countries should learn from this, I think, is the critical importance of transparency, of accountability. So many of the new players may not be as transparent as they should be. So which doesn't allow the mechanism of accountability to be activated when necessary. So it's really important to take into consideration also those factors along the way.
Really clear. We're in quite a different situation now to where we were before. But of course, and there's still opportunity and challenge. You've mentioned China already as one of Africa's new partners, in a sense. And, China always comes up in these discussions. I'd like to understand a little bit more about your insights on the Africa-China relationship and what you think, should be going forward with that relationship for our viewers and listeners. And specifically, Professor Signé, do you think African countries should be trying to get more or fewer loans from China? Should they be pushing for foreign direct investment from China, or even, with these ideas of public-private partnerships, we had some of those in the 1990s. Should African nations be trying to work with China on these now? Is that a possibility? What do you think for the future on the financing aspect in particular?
So this is an extremely important question, Hannah. So it's important to put things in context first. And per definition, so if African leaders are accountable, if they are responsible, I have no objections for them to engage with a broad variety of partners. So it is always better to have options than not. So as a leader of a nation, so usually in the debate, people will be on what favoring a side or another. So my point is the primary responsibility for African development, for negotiation, and for serving African interests, citizens' interests, lies with African leaders. If we agree that it is the case, then whether the African leaders engage with the American, the French, the British, the Chinese, the Brazilian, the Indian, should not be a problem. So the question is, the most important question is the one related to transparency. Are African leaders transparent in their engagement, in their contract, and in their partnerships with a broad variety of partners? This is related to China, but not just China, other partners as well, other emerging partners as well, but also established partners. So some of the agreements which were made decades ago, some of them are not transparently shared. So I think this is also really important because without a mechanism of accountability, the loans, nothing can really guarantee that the loans were properly used and that the people will not be paying ultimately poor decisions from their own leaders. So my perspective is not, so I'm more eclectic, if I can say it this way. So I think that African leaders have to be lucid but responsible. Unfortunately, many of the leaders are not responsible, but we also have responsible leaders who are committed to make a difference for their citizens.
That's really helpful and very clear in terms of centering this on African leadership and in terms of decision making and transparency. Do you have a view on what are the best accountability mechanisms that are out there at the moment?
I published a piece in at Brookings where I was speaking about accountable leadership as the key for Africa's transformation. And I look at accountability from four perspectives. So the first one is personal accountability. What are African leaders doing individually, and are they achieving what they were elected for? So that is the personal accountability. So the second level of accountability is the peer accountability. What are African peers when engaging with one another? What are they doing to ensure that their commitments is respected? So I think that is a second point which is really important. And when we speak about peers, maybe within a government, the engagement with other members of the government, or from a continental perspective, the engagement between African leaders, head of states and governments. So now the third level of accountability may be the vertical accountability. And now we are speaking about elections. We are speaking about people's choice and there, to what extent the vertical accountability mechanism, the electoral process is reflective of the will of the people. And there we speak about various elements which will include the regular election, free, fair, transparent, and their ability to be meaningful. So are they really contributing to the elected, to the selection of the leader, and eventually a sanction of a leader who may be abusing? And then you also have the another layer of accountability, which is the horizontal accountability, checks and balances. To what extent the various institutions, whether we speak about the parliament, the Supreme Court, and some element of the executive, to what extent the anti-corruption body, to what extent are they independent, and are they working together to ensure that ultimately the one abusing are not tolerated. And finally, we have what we call diagonal accountability, and that's also why where I was speaking about transparency, because with diagonal accountability, you have the role of the media, the role of intellectual, the role of people who will bring the attention, the role of the civil society, of non-governmental organizations, which will really play a role of watchdogs and really bring or activate elements of horizontal accountability. So I think those are some of the elements to which African leader could be held accountable in the context of COVID-19 and beyond.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Signé. I think that's also given us some really helpful insights into where next and what sorts of things to be really focused on as we go forward for African financing, African business potential, unlocking that, as your book really mentions and really focuses on. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. On behalf of our audience, if they would like to understand your perspective in more depth, get to know you a bit more specifically, where should they go?
Oh, thank you very much, Hannah. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you. And definitively, they can find me on the Brookings Institution website if they type Landry Signé, or to my on my website as well, landrysigné.com.
So thank you so much for your insights. I think those are absolutely helpful. And thank you so much also to our audience. Please do follow us at www.developmentreimagined.com and on Twitter at DevReimagined, and also, of course, our partner Quartz at www.qz.com/Africa. Thank you all for joining, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Bye.